So Brenton Zampatti is the principal research scientist with CSIRO, where he conducts research on the freshwater estuarine fish since the early 2000s, and Brenton has been investigating the ecology and population dynamics of fish in the lower lakes and Coorong. Big round of applause for Brenton Zampatti.
Thanks very much, Adrian and Kirsty and everyone for inviting us here tonight. 20 years far out, sort of goes in the blink of an eyelid, but it is 2 decades, and I feel fortunate to have worked, like many people, worked in this region. We keep saying it, but it is unique. It's where the river meets the sea, and I've been fortunate enough to work on a range of fish, the estuarine fish, the freshwater fish that Scotty spoke about. But tonight I'm going to be talking about diadromous fish, migratory fish, and the importance of flow, connectivity, and collaboration, or building relationships and working with people to get this done. First of all, I'd really like to acknowledge my co-author, Chris Bice. Chris and I have worked down here since Chris graduated from uni, I think. So for 16 years together, we worked at SARDI, and I went over to CSIRO a few years ago, but we still continue to work together. And also Aaron Strawbridge and Paul Jennings. Paul worked for about a decade with us, or probably a bit more, and really was the technical brains and grunt behind a lot of our work. And Straubs has picked up the mantle from that. So without these guys, we just couldn't do it. And talking about guys, we couldn't do it without, and they are predominantly guys. SA Water, for 20 years, well, almost 20 years, we've worked daily when we've been down here with the SA Water crew. They lift our traps for us, they carry them round on trucks, they operate cranes, they give us a few laughs. And back in the good old days, when they were sick of changing deck units, they'd even measure a few fish for us. So SA Water have been great. Chiefeng mentioned diadromous fish. Well, let's get some technical terms out the way. So yep, diadromous fish move between the ocean and freshwater to complete their lives. And I'm going to tell you the story, 2 stories, one about an anadromous fish. So these are like salmon. The adults move from the ocean into freshwater to spawn, and then the juveniles move back downstream to the ocean. And the other is catadromous fish, where the adults live in freshwater and they move downstream to the ocean to spawn, and then the juveniles move back upstream. If you're a fish that needs to move between the river and the ocean, a very important place for you is where the river meets the ocean. And here's a picture, sort of a contemporary picture of the freshwater saltwater interface. And if you can imagine the barrages weren't there and go back, this would have been a dynamic interface. It would have shifted backwards and forwards with river flow and tides. Yes, there's been some conjecture about it, but I think it's generally agreed now that that dynamic interface was sort of up to about Point Sturt, and that then the lakes were predominantly fresh. It's important ecologically. It's a very nutrient-rich place. When you're a little diadromous fish that comes in from the ocean, it's a good place to spend some time and grow before you move upstream. But it's also very important culturally. And there's this wonderful quote from the Narrandjeri Vision from the Natural History book about the meeting of the waters and the importance of that, the cultural and spiritual significance is crucial for Narrandjeri well-being. And I think it really captures what we think from a cultural perspective and an ecological perspective, which are one thing probably. Nevertheless, when Europeans settled in the basin, they saw water as a resource, and pretty quickly, as early as the late 1800s, started extracting quite large volumes of water from the River Murray. There were large weirs on the Goulburn River. There were pumps along the Murray, big pumping stations. So you're taking water out of the river, you decrease river flow, the lakes got saltier, people were relying on the lakes for fresh water, the barrages got built to stop that saltwater ingress into the lakes. When the barrages were built, there was no provision for fish moving past those barrages, except during high flows when most of the stop logs were out. So now, as we all know, we've got about 7 kilometres of barrages. that separate the freshwater lakes from the Coorong estuary. So you've lost that dynamic interface, or you've at least shifted it downstream of the barrages. So for 60 odd years post barrages being constructed, you had some fish passage during higher flows, but really there was very little ability for fish to move past the barrages, and also up along the River Murray past the locks and weirs. We were fortunate in the early 2000s, there was about $50 million at the time put aside to build fishways or fish ladders, a few of them on the barrages, and then one on each lock and weir all the way up to Hume Dam. We had the job, we was actually a tri-state team of Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia of assessing those fishways, and that included the fishways down at the barrages. I'm not really going to talk about fishway assessment tonight, but what we soon realised was that when we put traps into the fishways, it was a really good way of assessing the fish population itself, understanding what migratory fish were moving, when they were moving. You've all seen this climatic context, I suppose, for our studies. As I said, we've been working here for nearly 20 years. There's the millennium drought sitting right there, where very little water was released across the barrages, and then the higher flows post that. First fish I'm going to talk about is congoli, and congoli are a catadromous fish. So the adults live in freshwater, and principally the females live in freshwater. The males live in the estuary. They migrate downstream. We used to think to the estuary to spawn. We now know it's the ocean. And then the juveniles migrate back upstream. Congoli used to form quite a large part of the commercial fishery in the Coorong and lower lakes. And this is an article from 1941, just after the barrages had been completed. And at that time, there were 5 to 6 tonne of congoli a week hitting the Adelaide market over several weeks. Interestingly, these fish were caught at the Murray mouth, and they were probably females migrating to the sea. But 5 to 6 tonne a week is a lot of congoli. I don't think that happens anymore, and I don't think for a long time that congoli have been part of the commercial fishery, and that's because their migrations were impeded by the barrages. When we started sampling the fishways in 2005, there was a bit of a pulse down the river, sort of in the middle of the millennium drought, but a good pulse of water. We're sampling the fishways in spring, early summer, and we caught lots of these little juvenile congoli. So they're migrating from the ocean, spending their time in the estuary, and they're migrating to fresh water. And we knew that then they would be a good indice of the health of those congoli populations. Each year we could see how many of these young congoli were migrating. And this is probably one of the only graphs I've got, hopefully, just a couple of them. I've got no MDSs, so you'll be happy about that. What this shows here, this is the abundance of fish moving per hour, essentially. You can see the millennium drought there when the barrages were closed for 1,200 consecutive days, no fresh water. There's virtually no young of year congoli migrating. Why weren't they migrating? Well, probably the adults couldn't spawn. We didn't know at the time. We didn't know whether it was the adults not being able to get across the barrages to spawn, or whether there was failure in recruitment. So they were spawning, but the young weren't surviving. So as well as monitoring, we've been doing research, because I suppose monitoring gives you the patterns. Here's the patterns, but you really want to know what's causing the patterns. So that's the research, looking at the mechanisms. Adrian's already showed you this photo, but I had to use it because at the same time as we weren't catching any little baby congoli, we were catching octopus in the fishways. This is when the Coorong turned into a marine ecosystem, and that's another whole talk. But it was quite an, you could get a feed of King George whiting and octopus and probably some calamari and prawns as well out of those fishways, and I'm not really joking. We were looking at these female congoli which we thought lived upstream, and we were aging some of them at the time, like Scott said, with their ear bones. And we didn't find any females over about 4 or 5 years of age. Now, this was in 2008, 2009, and we were essentially worried that if the barrages remained shut, that then these females would die out and congoli in the Coorong and lower lakes would be in real dire straits. So we wanted to find out what the females were doing. What we did was we put acoustic tags into these females, like a little acoustic pinger, and then we put a series of listening stations. And this fish here was tagged, if I can find the pointer, tagged upstream of Mundu Barrage. And in August that year, July, August, that fish started this searching movement, trying to get past the closed barrages, and it just moved backwards and forwards, not getting through. And then when the Clayton regulator went in, it got trapped between the two, just moved backwards and forwards. We found this in 2008 and 2009, and we got to 2010 and we thought, these fish aren't going to get through, they're going to die. And we were working down at Goolwa one day, we knew the fish were aggregating above, and we're chatting to Ray Maynard, a Goolwa local. Ray was operating the crane. And we said, Ray, what do you reckon if we use the fish lock on the barrage and try and lock these fish through? So attract them into the lock and then open the Coorong end of the lock and they might swim out. And Ray said, all right, let's give it a go. And we actually had to get a few permissions at the time. And Carleen, I think we had to write a letter to you and get some permission. But we weren't going to use any water. That was the good thing. We were going to lock these fish. Anyway, I'm carrying on a bit. I drew this, I made an animation. This is what happened. So we attract the fish into the lock. Oh, the animation's gone wrong. And then the fish swam out. Anyway, that was the plan, okay? That was the plan. So we couldn't just put the fish in the lock. We wanted to see if they went in there. So we got one of our big fishway traps. We cracked the upstream end of the lock open. We put a pump, like to pump a bit of water to make a bit of excitement. We put the fishway trap in and we left it for a night. We came back the next morning, you lift the cage up with the Kato and you can hear fish flipping in it. Flip, 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 flip. And we thought, oh, we've probably got a cage full of mullet or something. This is what happened next. That was hundreds of female Congoli running ripe, full of eggs that had come into the fish lock. And it was pretty awesome for us. Like, everyone was amazed by it. And what we did for the next few weeks was each night ran that fish lock and essentially shifted those fish downstream. And then they moved, the little yellow dot before was they moved down the Goolwa Channel and out into the ocean. We were pretty excited at the time. The advertiser found out about it, and this is a highlight for my career. The editorial cartoon by Valdman was about the Congoli. And essentially this is the deprived boys in the Coorong hanging out, and a couple of ladies have just come through the fish lock. So yeah, that was pretty good. Pretty good outcome. Then we had the drought-breaking flows in 2010. So these fish had gone through, we had the drought-breaking flows. Then it took a couple of years for the Congoli populations to recover, really, and I think we needed to get some more adults. And this is the young of year again, as flow has actually increased over the last decade. So we consistently now get young of year Congoli. I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute when I talk about environmental water. The second story, have I got 4 or 5 minutes left? 1 minute, oh my God. The second story is about lamprey, and lamprey are an anadromous fish. So the adults migrate upstream in winter and they spawn in freshwater environments. Not much known about them in the Murray-Darling Basin, and for us it's really been a bit of a journey of discovery. They're globally important. In the Northern Hemisphere, they're a really important food fish. The Columbia River used to be huge runs of them in North America before they built the big dams. For First Nations people in the Columbia, still a very important food resource, and they'll risk their life downstream of these waterfalls to catch lamprey. Not a lot known in the basin, but if you go back to old newspaper articles in the 1950s, when some of the locks and weirs were built along the Murray, which probably impeded their migrations, people started to see them more, and they were quite abundant. But then in the decades to come, there's very little reported on them. We started trapping the barrage fishways in winter because we wanted to see if lamprey were actually migrating at that time. And we caught these blue fish here, are pouched, well, they're not really a fish, they're a very primitive fish, pouched lamprey. What we didn't know though is where these lamprey were going to go up the River Murray. Now, when the fishways were built on the River Murray, we put pit tag readers or microchip readers on each fishway. So what we did with these lamprey, we put a little microchip in them as they move through the barrages, same as you put in your dog and your cat, and then we could track them as they moved upstream. In 2015, we've done this for a few years. 2015, we tagged 50 of them. We had 25 of those reach Lock 1. Several others make it upstream. And the furthest we've recorded lamprey so far is Lock 11, which is about 900 kilometres or so upstream. We still don't know where they're spawning. They may be spawning various places along the way, but sometimes people see them in the Victorian tributaries of the Murray. So they can go a long, long way. So just summing up in 1 minute, Grace. It's the last talk of the night. I know you want to go home. What's changed in 20 years? Okay, so I haven't talked a lot about TLM indicators and stuff, but I've really tried to portray how management's changed because of our research. And summing it up, we've gone from 3 fishways to 11 fishways on the barrages. We've learned what fish are utilising those fishways and when they're using them. And now we have this suite of fishways that they have different functions, but all together they can pass fish at low flows and high flows. Environmental water is something we've heard a bit about. In the Millennium Drought, there was 0 holdings of environmental water. Now, this is the Chuo's environmental water. Sorry, it's not up to date, but it's over 2,000 gig a year. And I think, as Adrienne said, there's often 1,000 gig delivered down here. And down here is where you really see the influence of environmental water. The barrages traditionally under low or medium flows were shut in the winter. Come early in the new year, they were shut. No lamprey was going to move past them in winter. No Congolli was going to come downstream. Now environmental water is keeping them open. So you've either got environmental water and fish moving, or you ain't got water and you've got no fish moving. It's pretty stark. What about the future? I try and be a little bit rosy about the future. We know a lot's going to change. We know that there's going to be less water down the Murray, that in 50 years' time, the predictions are there's going to be quite a bit less water. So the gains we've made with environmental water, maybe we lose. The other thing we're going to get with climate change is potential rises in sea level and the barrages being overtopped. So what we're learning can help us adapt to that. And one of the things we might be able to do in the intervening time is explore some more flexible barrage operations. So are there times when we can leave the barrages open a little bit longer, like right open, and allow this dynamic flux of the estuary? And I can see Gary holding his head now. I'm not talking about removing the barrages and letting salt water into the lakes, but at times when it's safe to, maybe we allow a bit of a flux, a bit of a dynamic estuarine interface. Something to explore. All right, last slide. I think a lot of people have touched on this, but working with people down here has been one of the great things. And I work at quite a few icon sites along the Murray and other places in the basin. We do it really well down here with the CAP and the SAG. We've always worked closely together, scientists, managers, Narrandjeri, the broader community. There's been robust discussions, but it's always worked well. The other thing we're good at doing is we're good at telling people from upstream how important this place is and what we need. And I really hope we can go forward doing that together and reinforcing the need for water, because concrete and pumps aren't going to save the Coorong or enable us to restore the Coorong. It is water down the River Murray is the only thing. So let's do it together. Thank you.